Welcome to our Dream Deferred, a podcast that asks big questions and engages remarkable minds from a wide range of fields to help get underneath our unfulfilled American dream. I'm Thi Nguyen.
And I'm Karen Heller-Key.
We're colleagues working in human services, a field that works in every community to ensure Americans have the building blocks to achieve well-being. People in our field work to remove the barriers that get in the way of well-being. And that means getting to root causes, including the ways our shared beliefs, culture, and social systems and structures make it difficult or impossible for people and groups to ever achieve the stability and prosperity we all want and are promised. These past few years, as our country has become more fragmented and long-standing biases have come into plain sight, we've searched for ways to understand what we're experiencing more deeply and to benefit from perspectives that can help us envision a path forward. Our Dream Deferred is our way of engaging with important and diverse voices and bringing them to our field and beyond. Across Season 1, we will weave conversations into a picture to help us see anew where we are, how we got here, and how we can find a new way forward.
Welcome to our Dream Deferred and our interview with philosophy professor Thi Nguyen. I'm your co-host, Karen Heller-Key. Before we present this interview, let me say a few words about why we sought Thi out for our audience. One of the core ideas of this podcast is that we aim to explore how our country got where it is today, with the American dream deferred for so many and so much anger and division showing up everywhere, by engaging with what we call brilliant minds from unexpected places. Thi Nguyen fits that description perfectly. Right now, you may be asking yourself how expertise in philosophy can help us get underneath the troubling conditions and social problems facing our country and communities. We'd offer back what we've realized. Going down the well-trod paths seeking expertise won't help us to more deeply and fully understand what we're up against. We don't need one more political pundit to analyze strategies and tactics in the way we're accustomed to. If we really want to understand, we need to shine the light of inquiry more broadly. There's an old joke you may have heard about a police officer out patrolling one night when he sees a man kneeling down beneath a streetlight, apparently searching for something on the ground. "What are you looking for?" the policeman asks. "My keys," the man replies. "Where do you think you dropped them?" the policeman asks. "Down the block," the man replies. "Then why are you looking here?" asks the astounded policeman. "Because the light is better," the man answers. Our purpose with our Dream Deferred is to widen the circle of light we're looking under, to include more sources of insight, wisdom, and inspiration. A philosopher who studies the social aspects of how humans acquire knowledge, that is, how we come to believe what is true, Thi Nguyen thinks deeply about how we've come to live in separate realities. He helps us understand phenomena like echo chambers that are shaping and distorting how we see the world. As an added bonus, he brings in the philosophy of games and of art to the exploration, and it turns out to be very relevant. Buckle your seatbelts, you're in for a fascinating ride.
I am Thi Nguyen. I am an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Utah, and I have two strange specializations. One is social epistemology, and the other is philosophy of art. I think they're connected. Most people don't.
Thi, we like to start with a question about dreams, your own dreams, and also the American dream deferred that we explore in every episode. So, growing up, what was a big dream that you might have had for yourself? And how was your own dream related to or even affected by the state of the American dream?
I don't think I had a clear personal dream because I think I uptook my parents' dream, which was very much like the classical, comically stereotypical Asian American immigrant dream. What I'm saying is my parents assumed that I should be a doctor or a lawyer or a computer programmer. In fact, my entire family is like a large array of computer programmers and doctors, and I'm the one weirdo that's disappointed them, that like had all this promise, and then I went and did this weird thing that's philosophy. So, I failed their version of the dream. My mother still asks when I'm going to quit and get a real job like computer programming.
Well, we're thrilled to be able to know and share with you in the weird direction, we'll use your word, that you've gone. And I think it's really important, right, to think about the ways in which each of us has been shaped by our experiences as a child. And building on that, we love to explore with our guests how they bring their whole selves, their academic expertise, and their other interests and life experiences to the big questions that we are grappling with. From what we've learned about you so far, your story includes everything from social epidemiology to games to food writing. And so can you tell us a little bit about these dimensions and help us understand what they're all about?
So the field I'm in is called social epistemology. It's a kind of weird part of philosophy. So if you know anything about philosophy, a lot of philosophy is about this question of, how do I know anything? Like, how can I be sure? How do I know I'm not in the matrix? Like, that's what you get if you're in an introduction to philosophy class. And for a lot of us, what this has become is this. That question now sounds, which I was brought up asking in philosophy, now sounds like really individualistic to me. Like, I and a lot of other people are trying to think, no, it's much more complicated. It's about the huge network structure. Like, the most important thing is who you trust and why you trust them. I think this was, sometimes I think I'm in this realm because, how do I say this politely? I grew up and was raised by some people that I think were very untrustworthy. And I had to do a thing in my life where I was like, oh, crap. Like, how can I be sure of any of the stuff I've known and that I've been brought up believing? Because there's a philosopher, Descartes, that a lot of you probably know. In his first meditation, the way that the first meditation starts is he says something like, I suddenly realize that so much of what I was brought up to believe is corrupted and false. And so I just have to throw it all away and start again. And sometimes I think I had a similar experience, like a local version of that experience.
I'm reflecting on what Thi just said, and as a really interesting root of your academic interest, your life experience, and how that really moved you to pursue your enduring interest in what you study. I wanted to mention that how we first encountered you, our first experience of you, and as we go, maybe we'll trace some connections between the different aspects of all of your interests and your lived experience. We first encountered your work by reading an article that you wrote that I believe went viral called Escape from the Echo Chamber. And we were really struck by that piece. In that piece, you explore the question of how it is that Americans increasingly seem to not just disagree with each other, but to be living in separate realities with radically different ideas of what's happening and also how to understand what we're experiencing. So in that piece, you write about two phenomena, echo chambers and what you call epistemic bubbles. Could you help our listeners understand what those two phenomena are all about and what the differences between them and why echo chambers in particular are having such a big impact?
A lot of this comes from the fact that I've taught in some very different environments. So I started teaching, I'm a California progressive, and I started teaching in UCLA to students that were politically very like me. And I had this image of what the other side was like. And then I taught in Utah, and the place where I started teaching in Utah was the political opposite, like one of the most conservative counties. And I just had to cope with teaching there in this really interesting way because I had a lot of students who I knew were kind, thoughtful people, who I knew thought things through, who worked, and then they would say things. I remember we were talking about prison reform, and one of my students said something, who was a lovely person and a lovely student, just said, well, everyone knows that the prisons are just a way that the liberals figured out to sneak more handouts to the lazy poor. And I was like, wait, what? And she said this with the confidence of someone that was what everybody knew. And I just sat there, and I think she could tell from the look of shock on my face that was not something that was like, obviously part of my world. And I think that what I experienced there was exactly what you're talking about. Like, we're living in totally different worlds, like the basic facts. I mean, I think a lot of us, this was pre the most local rise of the alt-right, but it seemed like this sense of living in completely different worlds was really intense. And also the sense that the story I had as a California liberal, that the people on the other side just didn't think things through, right? That they were totally thoughtless, that I knew that couldn't be because I knew these students, right? They were thoughtful, they were kind, they struggled with the text, they wanted to understand things. And so I was reading around trying to understand this stuff. And I found a lot of work in sociology and media studies that didn't make sense to me. And a lot of it was about, I remember seeing all this work about how there were no echo chambers, right? Echo chambers don't exist. People think that echo chamber exists. I'm like, how could you think that with the experience on the ground that you have talking to people that spend their entire life listening to Rush Limbaugh? And what I ended up thinking is that a lot of people are making a mistake when they say that echo chambers don't exist. And what I think is happening, this is when the philosopher side of me is going to come out, is that they're conflating two very different concepts. So there are these two terms that originate in two different places that originally meant two very different things, and people have like smushed them together and lost something really important. So the two terms are the term echo chamber and the term epistemic bubble, or the more popular version is something like a filter bubble. A lot of you probably know this concept of a filter bubble. It got most famous in a book by Eli Pariser called The Filter Bubble. And what the idea of a filter bubble is, look, let's say that you're liberal. All your friends on social media are also liberal, so all you ever hear are arguments from the liberals. You never hear the conservative side. You never hear conservative arguments. The same, like if you're conservative, all your friends are conservative. They have your similar views. You never hear the other side. You're never exposed to other arguments. That's become like kind of the dominant narrative to explain what's going on. And people use the term echo chamber for that effect. But if you look at the early literature on echo chambers, and here there's this incredibly good book by Kathleen Hall Jameson and Frank Capella called Echo Chamber, and it's a study of Rush Limbaugh and Fox News. Their concept of an echo chamber is incredibly different. What they say an echo chamber is a structure which makes the members inside systematically distrust everyone on the outside, right? And these are totally different ideas. So a filter bubble or an epistemic bubble, a bubble is a situation in which you don't contact and you don't hear the other side. An echo chamber is a structure where you've been systematically taught to distrust or discredit what the other side says. And so one of the things that happened is there are all these people running around in empirical social sciences saying, look, there's data that shows there's no echo chambers. When you look at that data, what the data shows is that, and this is actually quite convincing, most liberals do click through to Fox News, do click through to various right-wing sites, and they know those arguments. And most conservatives click through, visit MSNBC, watch clips of Rachel Maddow. They know the liberal arguments, right? So it isn't a lack of exposure problem. So people are like, none of this stuff exists. But I think what has happened is people have confused these two incredibly different concepts. And what's really going on is an echo chamber. What's really going on is that people who are in echo chambers hear the other side, but they have some systematic discrediting. And that discrediting looks like all those news sources are liars, or all those news sources are in the pay of some corrupt blah, blah, blah. So you can see this going on with, for example, like anti-vaxxing and mass denialism. So people that believe in vaccination, like me, a lot of my friends want to say something like, look, there are all these people. Why are they just ignoring the science? Haven't they heard? Like, we just need to show them the articles or wave the facts in front of their face. And my view is that's not going to work, because people in the anti-vaxxing, anti-masking world already have an explanatory story that they believe that systematically dismisses scientific information as the creation of a corrupted, evil organization, right? It's not that they haven't heard, it's that they've dismissed that stuff at the root. I think one of the reasons people don't think as much about structures like echo chambers as they should is they systematically underestimate how incredibly much we trust and how vulnerable we are. I mean, one of the things I keep hearing is when people say, oh, the problem is with echo chambers is people aren't thinking for themselves. Just think for yourself. Do the thinking for yourselves. Like, don't be a sheep and don't like trust blindly in authority. The problem is that thinking for yourself is actually impossible. And in a really deep way. It's not that it's impossible to think. It's that it's impossible to think through and understand all the things you believe all the way for yourself, because the amount of scientific knowledge and other forms of expertise in the world are so vast that it is impossible for a human being to encompass all of it. Can I go back for one moment? I just want to be clear about something about this notion of cognitive bias. So I'm really worried about cognitive bias, but the echo chambers explanation is an explanation that actually explains things without attributing bias in certain ways. Let me tell you about the nightmare that keeps me up at night. It would be much more satisfying to believe that my side was bias-free and the other side was just operating with these cognitive biases that got in the way and, made them irrational. My worry is actually that the echo chamber path is a possible path where you could arrive at completely false information without biases, following only rational procedures. And what that looks like is, since you can't understand all science yourself, the way that you start out learning is by trusting the people around you to set your pathways of what institutions to trust. So my big worry is, and this is a very philosophical worry, that some of us just got lucky and had ourselves set in the right direction, and some people got unlucky, but they followed the same procedure of vetting new beliefs against the background people they were told to trust. So I'm not totally sure about this. Like, maybe there's a way out. Maybe there's a way to tell which side of these things, the side you're on. But I'm really worried that there's a bias-free path to being in an echo chamber.
So I'm thinking about your talent at juxtaposing realities, like the vast amount of information we have access to, particularly now, with what we know about cognitive biases, like tending to assume that we understand something and we know how to determine who to trust, and then also an understanding of social forces. And so I was thinking how one thing we appreciate about you is how you do such a great job of helping us understand a whole range of different forces, which we would say some of them are seen, some of them are unseen. And these are forces that really not only shape, but also distort our behavior, our thinking, our behavior, how we live our lives. And another area that you write about that we're really interested in is what you've written about games and how games help us understand the current moment. And I'm thinking in particular about your piece about the gamification of Twitter and other social media platforms and why that's troubling. So what exactly do you mean by gamification and why is it such a problem?
Gamification. So one of the things I'm really interested in is, there's this feeling that a lot of people have that whatever is going on in our political moment has gotten much worse. And there are a few different explanations for what's going on. Some of them are technological, and some of them implicate social media. So I'm really hesitant to blame it entirely on social media. I think among other things. So here's a useful argument that it isn't just straightforwardly caused by technology. If it's straightforwardly caused by technology, then you should expect the rise of conspiracy theorists and alt-right theorists in every country that's exposed to social media equally. That's not what's happening, right? There's good evidence. For example, Japan has just as high social media usage as America. Whatever that's happening to American politics isn't happening to Japanese politics right now. So you get vast asymmetry between countries that have very similar social media use. So I just want to issue a major warning. People really want to say like, oh, it's social media. So I can really recommend, by the way, a book called Network Propaganda. It's by a team of empiricists at one of the Harvard Technology Centers. And they're really interested in the fact that, so there's this one explanation that's like, look, social media is causing polarization in the world and causing people to hate each other. If that's right, then you should expect equal amounts of fact illiteracy on the left and right, because it's just a polarization of fact and everyone's using it. And you should expect this to be equally or relatively similar in different countries. Their view is that is not the case at all, right? So they actually think that social media is a mild accelerant, but it's not even close to the primary cause. And I'm really convinced by that argument. By the way, if listeners are interested in this and you don't want to read the whole book, I wrote a little piece for the Boston Review called Propaganda or Polarization that compares the empirical evidence we have for two narratives. One is social media is polarizing people, and then the other is no, there are specific media outlets, not all of them, specific ones that are issuing false propaganda. I'm on the propaganda side, by the way. But I also think that social media is it's an accelerant in this really intense way. And in the places where it's getting worse really quickly. And I want an explanation for why. So there are a lot of explanations, but one thing that I think people neglect is the game-like aspect of social media. So this is my other hat. I said that I work in social epistemology and the philosophy of art. I think they're really similar because social epistemology is about how people communicate knowledge, and art is our subtlest form of communication. But I got really interested in understanding what games were. So let me walk a slightly tangential path. So I love movies, I love books, I love music, but I also grew up playing games. And when I became an academic and started doing philosophy of art, I wanted to teach, and I started teaching about, the question that students love, are video games art? And what I found was all this literature that said something like, video games can be art because they're like movies. They tell stories, they have characters, they have beautiful graphics, like good cinematography. And you read all this stuff, and I was like, you know what's weird? There's nothing in here about difficulty or skill or play. I'm like, you're missing the heart of it. So I ended up writing this book, Games, Agency as Art, about what I think of as the real nature of games. And I think the most important thing about games is they don't just tell stories. They offer a different self for you to be in the game. I use the philosophical notion of agency, like they create an alternate agent. So what a lot of people talk about is that games offer you different affordances. They offer you different abilities. So my favorite game designer, Rainer Knizia, a German board game designer, says somewhere that the most important thing in the game designer's toolkit is the point system, because that tells the people what to care about in the game. I've been really struck by that observation. That observation turns out to be like at the heart for me of what games are. So here's a theory about games. A game designer doesn't just create worlds or stories. They create an alternate agency for you, an alternate self that has a different set of cares. And if you open up a game, it just tells you what to care about. It tells you you're competing, or you're competing for yourself, or you're on a team, or you're all cooperating, or you want money, or you want to kill each other, right? It just tells you what to care about. And we have this weird ability for a system to assign points to a thing and for us to just care about it. I think one of the pleasures of games is that for once in your life, values get to be clear, right? Like our actual life is really thorny and complicated and difficult and exhausting, and there are a billion values and they're all unclear. And like, I'm trying to be a good parent and balance that with work life. And how do I do that? And also, how do I know if I'm being a good parent? Because my kid is like this chaotic being that screams like stories all the time. And am I like, raising a child who's creative and wonderful, or am I raising an undisciplined monster? I don't know. How do I know? But in games, I know exactly what I'm doing. I know exactly what other people are doing. I know exactly how it's measured. And I know exactly how well I'm doing. So I call this value clarity. You get an experience of value clarity in games. It's beautiful. It's seductive. My biggest worry about games, so we have a lot of evidence that violence doesn't actually bleed out of games very much, that, this whole worry about games making violence is problematic. It doesn't happen. What I'm really worried about is that people that play a lot of games, like me, might export into the world an expectation that the world itself be similarly value clear. My slogan from the book is, I'm not afraid of games making serial killers. I'm afraid of them making Wall Street bankers, which actually I find more terrifying on a large scale. So one of the thoughts is, one of the things we should worry about is situations in the world in which something that's really valuable but subtle and dense and complicated gets gamified, gets a simple point system slapped onto it, and that might change people's motivations because it feels better when your motivations and values are simpler. And so I'm really worried that Twitter and other social media forms are really harmful gamifications. But what's going on in Twitter is that you're offered a point system that simplifies communicative values. There are 1,000 reasons you communicate. You communicate for a connection, understanding, empathy, to broaden your understanding, and Twitter doesn't measure any of that. Twitter merely measures popularity. So insofar as you're motivated by the points of Twitter, then, so my term is value capture. Your values are being captured by an external system. So the important difference in games and gamification is that game values are temporary. So I open up a board game. I'm told to care about killing your soldiers in the game. And then we put the game away and we put it aside. It's disconnected from the rest of life. The gamification of communication is pervasive, right? We don't put it away. Point on a board game change how I act in a board game, but that's a secluded space that doesn't have direct effect on the rest of the world most of the time. Twitter is a game that makes actual communication with people in political discourse more thrilling. But to be more thrilling, you have to care about the point. And if you care about the points, then you're accepting a simplified value system. And one of the things we know is that Twitter points you towards popularity, and the thing that is most popular on social media is expressions of moral outrage. The empirical results are pretty reliable. It's something like morally outraging content gets 4 times more retweets than anything else. So I'm worried that Twitter is amplifying non-technological social or structural problems by creating a communication system that motivates us towards popularity and outrage. That's my big worry.
One other thought that comes to mind in reading and listening to you talk about Twitter and gamification is the reality that most people participating in Twitter don't understand it to be gamified. So the phenomenon you're describing is invisible. Unlike taking out a board game and knowing that I'm playing this game now, people are not aware of what you've described there. So is that a big part of your concern, that people are in a game they don't know they're in and they haven't consented to the rules? Is that an important dimension, or how do you think about that?
People know that the points in Twitter have, like, what happens is if you taste virality once, it's just so, like, you see those points move and you're like, and people know that has this power, but I don't think they quite, I think when I talk about this stuff, what people do is they nod and they're like, oh, what I get told is that this clarifies something they felt inchoately, but I think people know. I just want to point out that this effect, this value capture effect, is not just social media. It's any situation in which we're exposed to a pervasive metric or measure that might change our motivation. So some examples: journalists and quick click numbers, academic researchers and citation rates, or if you're a professor of law, the status of your institution in the U.S. News and World Report ranked list. A lot of the stuff I'm writing about is worried about how, especially nonprofits and government institutions that have heavy exposure to demands for transparency, those demands for transparency generate simplified metrics. And then there's actually a lot of sociological documentation that once you get those metrics, people just glom onto them and they become incredibly motivating. I also worry that GPA turned out to be one of these things. So I think this effect is all over the place. And people sort of know, but I think they haven't fully articulated it themselves. One of the things I find striking is when I talk about this stuff, a lot of students come to me and they're like, oh my God, I've realized my whole life, I thought I had to struggle for GPA, but now I realize it's a metric that I have a choice about.
So part of the way what you're saying is so helpful is for people to recognize that they're in games that they don't realize that they're in, and they're accepting metrics and definitions that they maybe don't agree with. The other thing I was curious about, thinking about your book and your point about how games are about allowing us to have a different experience of our own agency and how powerful that can be. I've heard you talk about games that run by different point systems. So it's not always about victory, which is a very different kind of game. And I wonder if you think that there might be a way that games, whether they're online or offline, could actually help us to reverse some of this effect, the worst effects of gamification. And maybe even through games, can people have an experience of a positive sense of making a difference, of agency? What are your thoughts about that?
I have a very different view about this from a lot of other people. So a lot of people hear this stuff and they're like, okay, so we should they'll say, oh, then we should design games for social good in which people are given points for how much of some good they're doing. And this always seems to me like, okay, then you're doing that thing again. You're accepting a simple institutionally derived simplified metric as your value system. So that stuff I'm worried about. I'm actually much more interested in games' capacity to teach us to reflect on the value of point systems and to teach us some flexibility with it. So the goofiest part of my book is when you play all these games, so every game encodes a different kind of agency, a different mental style. Like some games are about deceit, and some games are about optimizing efficiency, and some games are about like building a team. And I think each of these offers you access to a different mental state. And when you play lots of games, you get access to, so my philosophy term for it is a library of agencies, right? Games are a library of agencies. And when you explore them, you get access to more agencies. But that doesn't mean that doesn't say don't play competitive games with point scores. That says play lots of them, play lots of different ones, and learn to step in and out of that mental system type, right? What you're learning is to step into something. So normal games have this built-in reflective point. You play the game, then you put it away, and you say like, was that worthwhile? Was that fun? So what you're actually doing is spending some time in the mental state of being totally trying to win, and then stepping back and being like, was that activity worthwhile? And I think if you do that a lot, if you play a lot of games and go in and out of these focused mental states, then you're actually practicing transition in and out of and reflection out of narrowly defined targets. The worry for me about pervasive gamifications like Twitter and grade point average is that there's no point of reflection. They present themselves as, no, here's the real value. And it's really easy to treat them as authoritative and monolithic. So it's not like I think we should stop playing chess and soccer and start playing these other games. I think what we should be doing is playing lots of traditional games, but the actual games help us practice this transition. It's a transition we actually need. Like in our normal lives, we often have to focus on one little thing for a while, right? Because we're limited cognitive beings, and then step back from it. So I think much more important is like the aesthetic, playful attitude towards games of trying them on for a while and then stepping back from them, rather than building better games that gamify moral elements.
It makes a ton of sense. And as I've been sitting here listening to you, I can't help but think about so many conversations I've had with my 13-year-old about who is definitely a gamer and always asking me to play games. And I default to only those that I feel that I can do well. And one day he shared that with me. He said, you only play the games that you think you're good at. And I was like, wow, that's a really good observation. What am I teaching if I'm not trying something new and recognizing that it's okay to be experiencing something and not knowing exactly what it is you're doing? So lessons from the 13-year-old to the rest of us. Shifting gears a little bit, although I think all of this is so interconnected in how we understand what we're experiencing in the world and how we think about it. But I've heard you talk about how as humans, when we are presented with a problem or concern, we tend to prefer what we call simplifying explanations. And can you tell us a little bit about what those are and why it's important to understanding them?
So I'm really interested in how there are all these systems where when people get into them, they're just like, they're so easy to use and crisp and clear that they just like stick. For me, one example is conspiracy theories, right? Like in every echo chamber you find a conspiracy theory. There are almost no echo chambers without something that looks like a conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theories are this unifying explanation where everything in the world suddenly makes sense. So I had a professor in undergrad, Richard Marius, lovely English professor. I remember him saying something I'll never forget. He said, there's something really similar between the pleasure of mystery novels and the pleasure of religion. In a mystery novel, you see all these random things. In the end, everything makes sense. Every clue is part of one perfect narrative and everything fits. That's really satisfying. And I think conspiracy theories do that. Everything can be explained with this one clever intellectual trick, and it feels so good and so powerful. The other explanation, I think, is actually, I think a lot of bureaucratic language offers a similar simplification where you have a few simple terms of explanation. If you think that everything can be justified with a cost-benefit analysis, then you have a really simple, quick way to dissolve thorny value systems, and it feels effective. You feel very effective. You feel like you can explain everything. All you have to do is ignore all the other values besides profit margins, right? So here's the complex way of putting it. We are limited beings. We can't think about everything infinitely because there's way too much to know. So we need a way to estimate what we should think about and what we shouldn't. And my suggestion is, again, it's a heuristic. As a quick way of operating, what most of us do is we use the feeling of confusion as a signal, oh, you should spend more time thinking about this, and a feeling of clarity as a signal of, oh, no, we're done. So if that's right, and I'm an intellectual manipulator, then I'm going to learn to simulate the feeling of clarity. So what's that look like? And so really interestingly, in philosophy, both in the philosophy of science and the philosophy of education, there's been a lot of work done about what clarity is and what understanding is, and this ability to like make the world look clear to you. And what they typically say is it involves having a model that's explanatorily powerful and that can make connections and make sense of a lot of apparently unorganized things. So my view is, if I wanted to manipulate you and get you to stop thinking, I would want to fake that feeling. And the way you do that is with something that is incredibly easy to apply to give explanations to everything. That's conspiracy theory. Right? That's what conspiracy theories do. They're engineered to give you the feeling that you can understand and explain everything with a single, simple model. It's like a cartoon candy version of scientific theorizing. So one of the things that frustrates me is that people say, "Oh, conspiracy theorists aren't thinking." I'm like, no. I think they've been seduced by extra tasty thinking. Because if you have a conspiracy theory, you're constantly emitting explanations, right? And you feel powerful because you have this explanation that just works on everything. So that's what I'm worried about. But I'm also worried the same thing is true of if you simplify your justificational structure in a bureaucracy, you get the same effect. So, for example, in my university, I should be clear, in my previous university, there's a move towards justifying everything in terms of student success, where student success is defined in terms of graduation rate, graduation speed, and salary, and postgraduate education. There are a lot of things that aren't on this list, like curiosity, love of knowledge, creativity, flexibility. Those are all super hard to measure. But if you narrow your value system to this, then it's really easy to generate quick explanations and quick arguments about what is justified and what is not justified, right? When you simplify your value system and your target, then the explanatory system becomes much clearer. Part of my goal here is, I suspect some listeners will be like, "Oh, conspiracy theories, you're talking about those nutty alt-right people. It's not me." And I kind of suspect that anyone enmeshed in any kind of large-scale institution is exposed also to a totally different version of this material. There's actually a bunch of anthropology and sociology about how the appeal of numbers in bureaucratic systems and political systems is partially because they present simplifications of complex value systems. So I can recommend Theodore Porter's book, Trust in Numbers, and Sally Engle-Mary's book, Seductions of Quantification. And these are not anti-science people. Like Sally Engle-Mary is a social scientist. But both of them are really interested in how the mere presentation of something in a metric, even if it's a bad metric, seems to be really convincing. And the reason seems to be because it, in my mind, has the simplifying clarity and the power to offer quick explanations and decisive explanations.
So I'm interested in connecting back to your expertise in aesthetics, in games, with food. I know you're a food writer. How does the interest that you have in aesthetics help you and help us understand really both what we're up against, but also like what the path forward might be? How can we use aesthetics to help us see that?
So I've done a little work about how you see the same problem in aesthetics. I'm really worried about things like quantified wine scoring and like Rotten Tomatoes and again, these simplifying, metrifying systems that threaten to undercut subtlety. This is my favorite pet topic. It's funny, like a lot of the times people ask, like, well, tell me the game or the metric I need to impose to fix this problem. And my worry is it's just not the kind of problem you can fix this way. So I genuinely think that the nature of aesthetics and art and the nature of play are kind of an antidote to the simplifying tendency. Stolnitz says something like, when you have practical vision, you're narrowed and you only see the things that are relevant to the interests you already have. So you could never discover new values. Aesthetic vision is the time when you take away that kind of narrow practical vision and just see things in all of their aspects, and you're open to any value that's in the thing. There are other views that say, like, what aesthetic perception is like, it's when we look for things that can't be explained with simple principles. There's a long tradition that says that what it is to be beautiful or graceful or funny, what makes those different from other kinds of properties are that those are things that can't be derived from principles. Like, they're things you have to, like, feel or be sensate with. Martha Nussbaum, who's one of my favorite philosophers, she says that moral systems that give you explicit codes will never give you enough sensitivity to actually navigate the complexity of a highly contextual world. And what you need is trained sensitivity. And the place that you get trained sensitivity from two places: living life and narrative arts. What narrative arts are at their best is ways of increasing the fineness and delicacy of our perception. One of my favorite papers that my students, I teach as much as I can, it's called World Traveling and Loving Perception, is about what it is to be playful, is willing to move lightly between different normative worlds and different value landscapes and be able to step into and try on other value systems. And so, in general, the worry I have is that there are these dogmatic, simplifying systems that once you're stuck in them, they obliterate your vision of what's outside of them. And the tendencies that we have of opening up the vision, seeing things that are outside of what we thought was important, that shit's in the space of aesthetics, art, and play. So I do think that those are resistant tendencies. And they're, increasingly marginalized because if the value for them is not easily put in some kind of clear, explicit, metrifiable system, then I, of course, am talking about, I'm in a space where, like, in universities, like art departments and philosophy departments are being cut out because it's hard to show what the value add is in measurable terms and in institutionally measurable terms that are easy to collect. So art gets squeezed out of stuff like this.
Well, it's such an important conversation for so many of our listeners who work in the space of social services, human services, and I think, too, often find it difficult to both show the full nature and complexity of the systems and people that we work within. And there is a tendency for the easy simplification, quantification, and it often also kind of gets lost in the conversation. So, Thi, I really want to thank you for spending so much time with us and taking us really around a very global and merging those two areas that you work in such a beautiful way. I want to thank you first for sharing a number of additional ideas for people to read. We'll add those to our show notes. And if you have additional things that you think we should include, we're happy to do that. People really love to go further, right, when they get really interested in someone that is on the show. But I want to leave kind of on the same nature of widening the lens and the spirit that we have a lot of people who are concerned about where we're at and also wanting to know what they can do as leaders and organizations to contribute to meaningful pro-social avenues forward for us as a nation. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share from your vantage point and experience, where do you think we should place our greatest energy right now? Where's your greatest hope for us being able to work through some of these negative forces in the way that they impact all of us?
I have a really philosopher pie in the sky answer to this. And then you're going to ask me, how do I bring it into reality? And I'll say, I have no clue. That's your job. So if you think the problem is filter bubbles, that is broken avenues of communication where you don't hear the other side, then you're going to think the right answer is more exposure. So people like Cass Sunstein, who's, a major social scientist, he says, like, people aren't talking to each other anymore. And what we need is to create forums where people run into each other. That, if you believe that the problem is broken trust, that's not going to work, because people are going to run into each other holding background theories about how these other people are evil, malicious, and that stuff won't work. The real problem, I think, is much harder, which is that trust has been systematically undermined and redirected, often for the interests of, for people that are operating not in the public interest. And the thing that we would need to do is restoring trust. Repairing broken trust is at the center, and I have no idea how to do that. If you read this book, Echo Chambers, on Rush Limbaugh, they don't quite come out and say it, but it's really clear that what they think is that the structure of an echo chamber is a lot like the structure of a cult, right? You're taught to distrust everyone on the outside. Only the people on the inside are trustworthy. So the way that people get pulled out of cult is never a direct route. It's never like something like, everything you've been taught is wrong. It's something like, you make a social connection. You realize that somebody that you were told all along is evil is actually kind of a decent person. And then you start trust building. So it's not just mere exposure to other people's ideas. It's this other thing. I mean, when I say this stuff, some people will be like, oh my God, you're asking me to make friends with the people that are oppressing and hurting me. And I think, I don't want to say that everyone has this obligation, but I do think that, I find myself in the capacity where I do have the energy to attempt to have a human relationship, in my case with students, and to gain trust. And then once some of that trust is built, then I can use it to try to ask questions about what looks to me like systematically narrowed trust structures. Repair trust on a national level. I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I think it's so much of what brings us to these conversations is, I think, the recognition that there isn't a silver bullet. There's not a single way forward. And so important to have voices like yours, though, that are really able to think deeply and turn the lens on something sometimes to say, well, maybe we aren't seeing it in its full picture, or we haven't really gotten underneath the roots, and just really appreciate that. I think it's so important to what we're trying to accomplish here. So I want to ask Karen if there's anything else that you want to comment on. And again, thank you so much for taking so much time with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm echoing you, Tracy. I think my reflection as you were talking, Thi, about your thoughts, but also not having a glib solution, is that the experience of walking with you through your perspective taking and diagnosis, what you're offering to our listeners, that feels like a very important step. And why we're doing this podcast is to give people different ways of having an awareness of what it is they're dealing with, and some ways of thinking about it. But the other is, to your point about how we treat other people and restoring trust, the experience of bringing your humanity to a conversation, your full humanity, to me, is part of how we have a hope of escaping from these very narrow ways of experiencing each other. And so the experience of the past hour, to me, models some of what we might take away as pointing us in a path forward. So I just really want to appreciate your ability to help us with the diagnosis, but also being very genuine, so that that's also something that's modeled and that people can experience by listening. So thank you very much.
Our Dream Deferred, Fulfilling the Nation's Promise is an APHSA production, hosted by Tracy Waring-Evans and Karen Key. Editing and sound design by me, Brandon Mitchell. Our team also includes Christina Becker, Jenny Hogan, and Jessica Guerin. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.